Boys and girls, happy missionary story. This is titled Through Water and Fire. It's very exciting. Here we go. It was 35 degrees below zero. Icy cold gripped the forests and lakes of northern Ontario, Canada, in an iron fist. It was a good day for staying comfortably beside your fireplace or heating stove. But the two men on the mission snowmobile had a job to do, and they needed a cold day to do it.
There goes a moose.
Morley Meekus, the Indian driver of the snowmobile, shouted above the engine's roar. How his alert, dark eyes had seen the huge, shadowy figure before it melted back into the forest.
Well, there's the tractor.
The second man replied with a grin. Alvin Frey, the missionary, knew he would probably never be so wise in the ways of the North Woods as the Cree Indians to whom he preached, but he did have many new things to show them. When Alvin had arrived at the Deer Lake Mission a few years before, he found the Cree Indians there living in deep poverty. All their food supplies, except for what meat and fish they hunted for themselves, had to be purchased at high prices from the trading post. Deer Lake was over 100 miles from any road, so supplies were expensive. Most Indian families made less than $1,000 a year, so when hunting was poor, they had little to fall back on. In despair, many of the men spent their last cent on whiskey to drink and forget their hungry families for a few hours. How could Alvin show these people that Jesus cared about them? How could he help them to help themselves? Both questions had found one answer in the tractor, which now stood under the crude shed at the end of the woods. Christians in the East who were concerned about the missions to the Indians had raised money to buy the tractor. This machine was the first tractor ever seen by the Indians of Deer Lake. It had made a big difference in their lives. Several acres of woodland had been cleared with the tractor, and Alvin had showed the Indians how to plant potatoes for themselves. Soon the garden was producing tons of potatoes and turnips for the village of Deer Lake. The garden patch was on an island across the lake from the village. During the summer, the tractor had to stay on the island, but now that Deer Lake was frozen over, Alvin was going to drive it back across the lake, across all the ice. All the people of the village were eagerly waiting for their turn to use the tractor for hauling firewood.
Better measure the ice again on this side,
Morley advised. Taking his axe, he began chipping a hole in the frozen surface of the lake. Meanwhile, Alvin fueled up the tractor and prepared to start the engine. When the two men were satisfied that all was ready, Alvin started the tractor. The engine roared into life, with clouds of exhaust smoke hanging in the frosty air.
Are you coming?
He called over his shoulder to Morley as the tractor chugged slowly out onto the ice.
As soon as I get my skidoo going.
The Indian shouted, bending over his snowmobile. For some reason, the machine was slow to start. Sinking back onto the seat to rest for a moment, Morley watched Alvin and the tractor proceeding across the frozen lake. Suddenly, a horrible, threatening
crack
sounded through the distant ice. Morley gasped and stood staring as the rear end of the tractor lurched sharply and began to sink. Somewhere beneath the ice, a flowing current of water had worn a thin spot in the frozen surface. And Alvin, with the tractor, had hit that thin spot.
Help! Oh, God, help him!
Morley cried out as he tried frantically to start his own engine. Out on the lake, Both tractor and missionary sank through the hole and were gone. Pinned beneath the steering wheel of the sinking vehicle, Alvin Frey struggled vainly to free himself. The shock of the freezing cold water soaking through his thick clothes almost made him cry out in pain, but he instinctively held his breath as his head went under. Down, down into the dark depths sank the heavy tractor. 10 feet, 20 feet, 30, 40. As the tractor's tires touched the muddy bottom, 50 feet from the surface of the lake, Alvin finally managed to free himself from the seat.
Hurry, swim back up,
Alvin told himself, but his winter clothes and boots weighed him down. His body was becoming starved for oxygen after several minutes underwater.
Don't breathe the water, or you'll drown. Mustn't breathe.
His mind warned dimly. With painful slowness, he rose back to the surface. Fuzzy thoughts and pictures began to whirl dizzily through his fading brain.
What will my family do if I don't make it? My wife Lydia Ann, my children, and all the Indians here at Deer Lake Mission. Oh, why did I lose the tractor?
With a gentle bump, Alvin's head hit a sheet of ice. Hope flared quickly, only to be replaced by despair.
If I've come up under the ice, I'll never get out,
the missionary thought.
Well, I'm ready to die. Lord, here I come.
Suddenly, the broken cake of ice floated away, and Alvin's head shot out into the air. Frantically, he breathed and breathed, gulping great lungfuls of oxygen into his aching body. His dazzled eyes took in the beauty of the sunlit trees and sparkling snow, but for a fleeting moment, Alvin felt a stab of disappointment.
Heaven was so close,
he thought.
I was almost there. Another moment, and I would have seen my Lord Jesus.
Brrr! A motor roared nearby as Morley Meekus arrived on his snowmobile just in time to pull the dripping missionary onto a solid patch of ice.
Oh, Brother Alvin, you're alive,
cried the Indian, his dark face wet with tears.
You were under the water for 10 minutes. I thought there was no hope.
He hurried Alvin onto the snowmobile, and the two men sped away. It was another mile and a half back to the village. By the time they stopped in front of the trading post, Alvin's wet clothing had frozen to solid ice. Unable to move his arms or legs, the missionary allowed himself to be carried into the warm store.
Talk, Alvin,
shouted his Indian friends, beating their fists on the icy shell around his body.
Are you all right? Talk to us.
Breathlessly, the missionary laughed.
Calm down,
he said.
I'm all right. Just let Morley tell you all about it while I get warm.
When he had heard the story, an old Indian wisely nodded his wrinkled head.
Now I know this white man tells the truth,
he said solemnly.
Or else he would never have come out of that water alive.
3 weeks later, the police put a trained diver on a plane and sent him to the mission. Wearing a special suit, the man dived into the lake bottom and fastened a cable around the axle of the tractor. Soon, the mission tractor was back on the job. As months passed, Alvin began to understand one reason, at least, why God had allowed the tractor to fall through the ice. When Christians throughout the country learned of what had happened, they made new efforts to support the mission work. In church after church, as the story was told of Alvin Frey's narrow escape, many people pledged to send money for the missions among the Cree Indians. 6 years slipped by as Elvin Frey and his family continued their work with Northern Light Gospel Mission. He never forgot the day that God had spared his life in the freezing lake. And then came a morning when Elvin's faith was to be tested by fire as well. The weather was cold once more, and Elvin needed to keep the furnace going in the basement of the mission house.
Looks like it's gone out.
He observed one morning, poking around in the ashes of the dead fire.
I'll have to use some of this.
Reaching for a bottle of old diesel fuel, he squirted some of the logs piled in the firebox.
Vroom.
With the sound like ripping cloth, the diesel fluid exploded into the air. The bottle blew up in Elvin's hand, spraying fuel all over Elvin, turning him into a human torch before he could react to what was happening. Flames sprang up all over the basement.
Oh no, I'm on fire!
The horrified missionary screamed. Seizing the first blanket he could find, Elvin rolled himself into it to smother the flames. Quick as he was, though, the fire had already eaten into his face, arms, and chest. Loose, shriveled skin hung in shreds from his blackened body as Lydia Ann came running to meet him at the head of the stairs.
We've got to put that fire out,
Elvin gasped. For the next 15 minutes, the couple ran back and forth with buckets of water from the kitchen. Not until the fire was doused and the mission house safe did Elvin take time to think of his own burned body.
You'll have to go to the hospital,
his wife declared, and Elvin reluctantly agreed. Across the frozen lake at the trading post, the mission nurse radioed a helicopter.
The helicopter is at God's Lake and can't get to you.
And a storm is on the way, a voice replied on the radio.
Oh. But Whitey Holstezer can come pick you up and can come pick up your patient and fly him to Red Lake. Have the Indians choose a place where he can land on the ice and mark it with cedar branches.
Storm clouds were gathering. Soon the air would be filled with whirling snow, making flight impossible. Would Whitney, the pilot, be able to get the injured missionary to Red Lake in time? As Elvin lay in the schoolhouse beside the lake, his burned face and body grew steadily more painful. Dimly, through the agonized throbbing, he knew that dozens of Indians were coming and going beside the cot where he lay. The Christian Indians, members of his congregation, were taking turns coming in to pray over their missionary. Out on the ice, more men worked to mark a landing place for Whitney's small plane.
The ice isn't safe,
worried one neighbor.
It really isn't thick enough to land a plane on.
The pilot himself had come to the same conclusion.
I won't be able to make a complete stop,
he radioed to the Deer Lake villagers.
Have Elvin waiting on the ice and be ready to help him as I come past.
Snow was starting to fall as two strong Indians trudged onto the frozen lake, carrying the injured missionary between them in a blanket.
The plane's coming,
a boy shouted from the bank. A motor whined, and the three small cedar aircraft flew over the trees. Making a tight circle, Whitney sailed the plane down toward the waiting group. His pontoons barely touched the weak ice as he throttled back the engine.
Ready, set, go,
one Indian chanted. Holding open the passenger door with one hand, Whitney skimmed alongside. At just the right instant, the Indians dashed forward, shoving Elvin into the plane.
Got him!
Cheered a watching crowd as the door closed and the plane zoomed off across the lake. Just then, there was a howl of wind, and the storm descended in all its fury.
10 minutes later would have been too late,
dark-skinned Morley muttered to a friend.
Let's go home and pray some more.
After Alvin reached Red Lake, he was put into a larger plane for the flight to the hospital in Winnipeg. It was evening before he was admitted to the hospital's burn unit. The masked doctors and nurses shook their heads as they worked with salves and bandages.
This is a bad one.
A nurse whispered to her companion.
He'll be in here a long time.
As Alvin lay suffering in his quiet bed that evening, he thought bitterly of the morning's events.
How could I have been so stupid?
He scolded himself.
What a dumb thing to do, to cause all this trouble for everybody.
Suddenly, a quiet figure stood at his bedside, face covered by a hospital mask.
Do you know me, Alvin?
Came a woman's voice. It was Sadie Yoder, a missionary who worked in Winnipeg. Softly, she prayed over Alvin, then slipped out of the room again. A few minutes later, another Christian came in.
Brother Alvin, you and I never met before.
This man said cheerfully.
But the Lord told me to come in and pray for you tonight.
Laying his hands lightly on Alvin's head, he began to speak with God. While the stranger prayed, Alvin felt his bitterness melt away. From disgust at himself, his attitude changed to joy.
In everything, give thanks,
he thought.
Yes, that verse means even this. I can still rejoice in the Lord. Oh, so many people have been praying for me. All my Indians at Deer Lake. I didn't know they cared for me so much. And now Sadie and this brother whose name I don't even know. Thank you, Lord, for all this love.
As Alvin's spirits lifted, he felt something happening to his face. The pain was fading away, and he could sense a difference in the way his skin felt. Soothed and sleepy, he drifted off into a refreshing slumber. In the morning, a nurse came to change his bandages. As the last strips of gauze fell from his face, she gasped in surprise.
Didn't you just come in last night?
The nurse exclaimed.
Your face is already healed. This is impossible.
The burns on Alvin's body took a little longer to heal. But still, he was ready to be dismissed from the hospital in record time. Before he left, the head nurse came back in to shake his hand.
Mr. Frey, I hope you realize this was a miracle,
she stated.
Most people with burns as bad as yours need to be in the hospital for at least 6 weeks.
Alvin's face lit up in a radiant smile. His bushy eyebrows still had not grown back completely, but very few scars remained from his trial by fire.
God is great,
he told the nurse simply.
And I had a lot of people speaking to him for me.
The end. And there's a little historical note here. It said, Alvin Frey worked for 20 years with the Northern Light Gospel Mission. He fell through the ice on the tractor in 1963. The fire occurred in 1969. With his wife and 5 children, Paul, Larry, Steve, Kelvin, and Ruth Ann, he remained in the Lord's work in Canada. He became the pastor of a church in Manitoba. And I looked up an actual picture of him online, and he was born in 1928, and he died in 2013. So he lived for 85 years. And here is a picture of Alvin Frey. Where is it? Right there, when he was an older man. So this was the actual missionary that we just read about. Wow, pretty exciting, cool story. We hope you enjoyed it. Have a great day.
Bye.